Mention the term Munchausens by proxy, and most people will think of Gypsy Rose Blanchard and her decades of medical abuse that she suffered because of her mom, Dee Dee. True crime nerds like myself might remember other cases, like Lacey Spears or Kathy Bush, or the OG Munchausen's mom, Mary Beth Tinning. Thankfully, these cases are extremely rare. But in 2019, another tragic case of Munchausens by proxy made the news in Colorado, that of Kelly Renee Turner and her sweet, bubbly little daughter, Olivia Gant. Let's get into it. Welcome back to my channel, and if you're new here, welcome. I really appreciate you spending time with me. I'm Delaney, a true crime writer and all-around murder nerd. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe for more videos like this. But let's get back to Kelly Renee Turner and her 7-year-old daughter, Olivia Gant. And content warning, if cases involving children are too much for you, you might want to sit this one out. I get it, we all have our limits. Olivia Gant was born June 21st, 2010 in Pasadena, Texas to Jeff and Kelly Gant, who would also go by Kelly Turner. She was the youngest of 3 sisters who I'm not going to name out of respect for their privacy. A little over a year after Olivia was born, in August 2011, Kelly began blogging about the many health problems her 2 younger daughters suffered from. She said Olivia had a malformed skull and a vascular problem in her brain that caused her to have seizures. She also had developmental delays, a tumor on her parotid gland, too much fluid in her brain, and celiac disease, according to Kelly. Kelly also wrote that her middle daughter had osteomyelitis, a type of bone infection, as well as non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and a severe immune deficiency. She also frequently solicited donations to cover the girls' medical bills and travel expenses. But some of the stuff she wrote on her blog didn't quite add up. For example, in one post, she said Olivia's corpus luteum membrane in her brain was thinning. The corpus luteum is not a membrane, and it's found in the ovaries. In 2012, Kelly moved the girls to Colorado in order to be closer to the world-renowned Colorado Children's Hospital, where she felt her girls would get the best care for their many diseases. Their father, Jeff, couldn't leave his job in Texas, but he would travel to Colorado to visit when he could. That year, when Olivia was about 2 years old, her mom took her for her first visit to Children's Hospital for what Kelly called feeding difficulties, or really just picky eating. According to Kelly, Olivia refused to eat anything but cereal and a few specific fruits. And as anyone who's ever had a 2-year-old will tell you, that kind of thing is totally normal, and the kid usually just kind of grows out of it after a while. But it was at this visit, the first of over 1,000, that Kelly reported Olivia's history of seizures and other health problems. The hospital staff recommended occupational therapy for Olivia's, quote, feeding difficulties. The new therapy went well, and Olivia began eating normally. But then in 2014, Kelly brought Olivia back in for severe constipation. So severe, she needed to have surgery to remove the impacted stool. So in November of that year, she had the first of what would eventually be more than 24 surgeries. An ileostomy, which reroutes the small intestine to bypass the colon so that the waste goes into a bag through a tube in her abdomen. The surgery relieved Olivia's constipation, but soon afterwards, Kelly brought her back in, claiming that Olivia was unable to eat normally. So within a 6-month span, Olivia had 3 different types of feeding tubes installed. One that went in through her nose and then 2 through ports in her abdomen. When Kelly told them that Olivia couldn't tolerate being fed that way, the doctors installed an IV to send nutrition through her veins, called total parenteral nutrition, or TPN. Over the course of the next year, Olivia became a regular patient at Children's Hospital. The staff even gave her a nickname, Princess, because she always wore her princess dresses while she was in the hospital. But despite normally being a happy, sociable, and energetic little girl, when she would learn that she was about to have another surgery, she would cry and scream and kick to try to get away. It was also during this time that a hospital neurologist determined that Olivia did not have seizures. She told Kelly on multiple occasions to stop giving Olivia the anti-seizure medication she was on, one of the side effects of which is decreased appetite. Kelly refused to comply, and apparently no one stopped the refill orders for that prescription. Kelly was aggressively involved in her daughter's medical care. She pushed for treatments and wasn't afraid to complain up the hospital chain of command if her demands weren't met. One nurse's aide remembered her frequently getting irate or upset if the nurses contradicted her and going to the supervising nurses or calling the doctors directly. This aide said they were jumping through her hoops because she was so public. She said this was because Kelly, quote, could make or break Children's Hospital. This was because during the last year, thanks to her adorable personality, Olivia was becoming something of a celebrity spokesperson for Children's Hospital, frequently hosting fundraisers and toy drives and being featured on their promotional materials and fundraising videos. It was in July 2015 when Kelly set up a GoFundMe campaign for Olivia's medical bills. On it, she said that Olivia had added a new diagnosis to her already long list. Now, in addition to a tumor, developmental delays, seizures, autism, sensory processing disorder, focal cortical dysplasia, digestive issues, and hydrocephalus, she wrote that Olivia now had neurogastrointestinal encephalomyopathy, a rare genetic disorder that affects several parts of the body, but mostly the digestive and nervous systems. Kelly wrote that it would eventually lead to her death. That GoFundMe campaign would bring in over $22,000. Around that same time, she also had Olivia make out a bucket list of things she wanted to do before she died. By the end of that year, 2015, based on what Kelly had reported to hospital staff, Olivia's medical records stated she was in intestinal failure, which is when the intestines lose the ability to digest and absorb nutrients from food. Olivia was also diagnosed with pseudo-obstruction of her intestines, which is a diagnosis that's given to patients who exhibit symptoms of having blocked intestines, but the doctors can't actually find any physical obstruction. But what those doctors didn't know was that around that same time, the home healthcare company flagged 3 antihistamines on Olivia's extensive medication list. These drugs, when combined with the large doses of oxycodone she was also taking, could amplify the negative effect of those opioids to the point that her intestines could lose the ability to push food along. And in the weeks before Olivia's intestinal failure diagnosis, Kelly's descriptions of her ability to eat were inconsistent. Sometimes she said Olivia couldn't eat anything. Other times she said she could eat soft foods like yogurt and applesauce. And in fact, a month before intestinal failure was listed on Olivia's records, the staff documented her eating small amounts of food with no problems. And her doctors noted she must either have been eating some food or have an unusually low metabolic rate because the calories that she was receiving through her TPN weren't enough to explain her relatively stable weight. During the next year, 2016, Olivia would be in Children's Hospital for all but 6 weeks, during which time she was given ever larger doses of narcotic painkillers. In early 2017, the Make-A-Wish Foundation, along with other local nonprofits, began helping Olivia fulfill her bucket list. She had a bat princess party, rode along with Denver police to catch a bad guy, put out a fire with firefighters, and other fun activities, all of which was covered by local and national media. On March 1st of that year, Olivia underwent her final surgery, this time having a tube inserted into her bladder that would drain out her abdomen. After that, Olivia's condition seemed to deteriorate quickly. On March 24th, Kelly requested a do not resuscitate order, specifically that Olivia not be resuscitated or given naloxone if she stopped breathing because of the large doses of opioids she was receiving. In Olivia's medical records, it's recorded that Kelly said, "If Olivia dies while we are rotating opioids, it is God's time to call her home, and I am not going to stop that." She said, "I will not watch my child die while you guys are pounding on her chest or sticking a tube down her throat." So now she's upset about them sticking tubes in her. Got it. Later, after giving that DNR order, Kelly urged one particular doctor on duty to double Olivia's dose of opioids. The doctor refused, saying the dose she was requesting could knock out a fully grown adult and would most certainly stop a child's breathing. Kelly is recorded as responding, "Well, she's DNR." The doctor said that that was precisely why he wanted to be cautious, and he did not increase her dosage. On March 27th, 3 days after requesting the DNR order, Olivia's care team raised concerns that the amount of stool in Olivia's ostomy bag and the amount recorded in her chart didn't add up. This is important because the amount of stool is a vital clue as to how well a patient's intestines are functioning. And then Kelly was caught emptying Olivia's ostomy bag. So doctors assigned a nurse to monitor Olivia's room one-on-one for 24 hours. The monitor was tasked with watching the output and ensuring accurate measurements were taken. During that time, the amount of stool improved significantly. Doctors weren't sure if she improved on her own, or if it was the result of the new medication they gave her, or if the monitor had prevented tampering. The doctor who ordered the monitor wrote in Olivia's records that the timing of the improvement did raise questions. But Kelly was, quote, very distressed by the decision to assign the monitor, and she threw a fit. She accused the hospital staff of punishing her, that they thought she was a bad mother and were questioning her ability to care for Olivia. 2 days after this, Kelly requested that Olivia be sent into hospice care, which, if you don't know, is care provided for patients who are at the end of their lives. She brought Olivia back to Children's Hospital 4 months later, this time for an infection related to one of the many tubes in her body. It was only then that hospital staff began to raise the alarm about potential medical abuse. Dr. Thomas Walker, a pediatric gastroenterologist, put his concerns into Olivia's medical records. He objected to Olivia's DNR order and refused to sign off on it. He also questioned Olivia's status as a hospice patient and called her current treatment plan, which involved large doses of opioids, dangerous. But rather than call the Department of Human Services, which as a mandated reporter he was required by law to do, Dr. Walker requested that the hospital's ethics committee weigh in on the situation. So the hospital's ethics committee held the first of 3 meetings in the summer of 2017. That first meeting was called to discuss the DNR order. Though the committee noted that Olivia was on large doses of opioids, they believed she was facing a terminal diagnosis, intestinal failure from pseudoobstruction, and that she'd been declining. Ultimately, the committee recommended continuing to follow Kelly's wishes. Olivia's care was then transferred from Dr. Walker to another one who was willing to sign the DNR order. The next 2 meetings were called because Kelly told doctors that she wanted to remove Olivia's TPN, the tube providing all of her nutrition. Doing so would obviously kill Olivia. Kelly claimed that Olivia's body was rejecting the TPN, which isn't actually possible. According to the records of those meetings, Olivia's medical providers were deeply divided. Some noted the recent deterioration in Olivia's condition and supported the decision to send her to hospice. Others had doubts that Olivia's quality of life was as poor as her mother seemed to believe, and said they'd seen discrepancies between her descriptions of Olivia's pain and symptoms and how Olivia appeared when they personally observed her. Kelly was so upset by this meeting that she walked out in a huff. She later told a member of the hospital's palliative care team that she felt it was selfish to prolong Olivia's life. Around this same time, the hospital's child protection team, a special team assembled to address accusations of child abuse, also became involved in the case. Despite hearing from multiple nurses and other care providers who expressed their concern that Kelly was not being truthful about Olivia's diagnoses and symptoms, the child protection team concluded that Olivia's case was, quote, not typical of medical child abuse, and that nothing currently rises to the level that would require a DHS report. Which again, is not in compliance with Colorado's mandated reporting laws, which only require a suspicion of child abuse to trigger a mandatory report to DHS. The final meeting of the ethics committee consisted of long, heated discussions with Olivia's nurses, doctors, social workers, the child protection team, the palliative care team, and others. But in the end, the ethics committee concluded that the hospital only needed to alert child protection authorities if a parent's decision was, quote, far outside the realm of what a reasonable person would do. Again, a violation of Colorado's mandated reporting laws. So on August 1st, 2017, Olivia was transferred to Denver Hospice, where her mother told her she was going to a place with no more owies. There's video of her on the transport bus from the hospital, and content warning, if you don't want your heart ripped out, skip to the time code on the screen.
And be into the worries for the rest of your days. Is our problem free? Philosophy, Hakuna Matata.
I chose to show this footage not just to show how much of a monster Kelly Turner is, but to really look at it. I know the quality is crap, but still, does this look like a child who's in multiple organ failure, who's only weeks away from death? I don't think so. Once Olivia was in hospice, Kelly removed her TPN. After that, she would only allow Olivia popsicles and juice and massive doses of narcotics. During these last weeks of her life, her grandfather, Lonnie Gautreaux, moved in with her and stayed by her side 24/7. He recalled that a few times, even though she was heavily sedated, she would look at him and say, "Papa, I'm hungry." He said that Kelly would tell him it was just the medication talking and would only allow her to suck on a wet sponge. On August 20th, 2017, Olivia Gant died. She was only 7. Her funeral was attended by nurses, doctors, firefighters, and police. Her obituary stated that she loved playing with her sisters, being on her iPad, or watching her DVDs. It further said that she had an unbelievable imagination that would entertain herself and others for hours, and that she gave others joy and laughter. Olivia was laid to rest in Seven Stones Chatfield Botanical Cemetery in Littleton, Colorado. And that's where her tragic short story might have ended. That is until October 2018. That's when Kelly began bringing her middle daughter, who was 11, into Children's Hospital with bone pain stemming from osteomyelitis. But when this doctor was transferred to another primary care doctor, that doctor was suspicious right away. Kelly had claimed that this daughter had been treated for lymphoma when they lived in Texas. So the new doctor called the medical providers in Texas to get her records. That's when he learned that Kelly was lying. Kelly's middle daughter never had cancer and had certainly never undergone chemo. And this time, rather than dick around with the hospital's internal committees, this doctor reported his suspicions of child abuse directly to DHS, who opened up an investigation. Kelly's middle daughter was immediately removed from her custody. She's reported to have been in perfect health ever since. And that DHS investigation quickly pivoted to Olivia's death. When investigators questioned Olivia's doctors, 11 of them stated that they doubted the intestinal failure diagnosis and many of the other alleged symptoms that Kelly had reported. One doctor told investigators he was shocked when he learned that Olivia had died in hospice and that Kelly had insisted on withdrawing medical treatment. He also told them he had never diagnosed Olivia with any of the diseases that she wrote about in her GoFundMe page. And a background check on Kelly Renee Turner revealed some troubling information. She had been arrested in 1998 for aggravated sexual assault on a child. She plea bargained down to felony injury to a child and served several years in prison. She also had previous convictions for impersonating an emergency medical technician and forgery. Caseworkers also dug up Kelly's old blog and Facebook posts, her GoFundMe updates, and her many, many news interviews. With that information, they were able to piece together an alleged motive. So in November of 2018, Olivia's body was exhumed and an autopsy was performed. The autopsy report lists her cause of death as undetermined, but more importantly, shows that there was no evidence that Olivia had any of the medical conditions her mother claimed. On October 18, 2019, Kelly Turner was arrested and indicted on multiple charges, including first-degree murder, child abuse, and second-degree forgery. She would later be charged with defrauding the Medicaid system of more than $538,000 and defrauding private donors of tens of thousands of dollars, including the Make-A-Wish Foundation, the people who donated to her GoFundMe, and the funeral home and cemetery who donated Olivia's funeral arrangements. Kelly did admit that she had made up her middle daughter's diagnosis, but swore that Olivia's illnesses were all true, and she pled not guilty to all charges. But on January 3rd, 2022, only a month before her trial, and only days before I'm filming this, she changed her plea to guilty to the lesser but still felony charges of child abuse causing death, theft, and charitable fraud. In exchange for her guilty plea, she could be given up to 16 years in prison. As for Children's Hospital, Olivia's surviving family filed a wrongful death suit against them, alleging that they disregarded several staff members' concerns about possible medical abuse and violated Colorado's mandated reporter laws. The family sued for $25 million, but the suit was later settled out of court. Olivia's case had nearly every hallmark of a Munchausens by proxy case, which is now called Factitious Disorder Imposed on Another, or FDIA. A female caregiver who is intensely, aggressively involved in the patient's medical care, who pushes for tests and surgeries even when they aren't medically necessary. Multiple, often conflicting diagnoses, usually of severe, life-threatening diseases, but no records or test results to confirm these diagnoses. The patient's observed behavior not aligning with the symptoms the caregiver reports. The caregiver falsifying tests or tampering with samples, such as secretly emptying an ostomy bag. And of course, the caregiver soliciting attention, help, and even money on behalf of her victim. Colorado's DHS, as well as other legal experts, are pushing for more education for mandated reporters and for medical personnel in particular to look for signs of medical abuse. If you suspect a child is being abused, medically or otherwise, please contact your state's DHS or call the national hotline number on the screen. One call could save a life. Before I go, I want to give a shout out to the Denver Post. Much of the information that I got for this video came from their in-depth reporting. I'll put the links to their stories in the description. That's it for today. Thank you so much for watching and spending time. If you enjoyed it, please give it a like and subscribe to my channel. Till next time, Darklings.